Hello and welcome to this podcast series, Free Irish Women in Indian Nationalism, brought to you by the University of Strathclyde. My name is Lucille and this is episode 4, Nationalist and Unionist Newspapers. So from the previous 3 episodes you have gained an idea of these women's lives and their work in Indian nationalism. Now we will consider how they were viewed by the Irish press, but here's a little bit of context first. Several historians such as Deirdre McMahon and Howard Brasted have written about the parallels between the Irish and Indian nationalist movements. The two countries, Ireland and India, were indeed alike. Both were part of the British Empire and suffered from the violence and economic exploitation characteristic of British rule. They had to pay annual sums to their colonial ruler, and the majority of their industries declined in order to protect Britain's own industries. In times of floods and famines too, Ireland and India were left to their own devices. The British chose not to intervene as their population starved. Therefore, as Ireland gradually wrestled from the grip of British rule, with the Home Rule movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century, then the Easter Rising in 1916, and the Declaration of Independence in 1919, India watched closely. In Ireland, they saw a counterpart and a potential model for their own nationalist cause. We can see the connections between Irish and Indian nationalism in the work of the 3 women who are the focus of this project, Sister Nivedita, Annie Besant and Margaret Cousins. You can hear about the details of their lives in the earlier episodes in this series. To some extent, their Irish background inspired their involvement in Indian nationalism. Yet it's important that we do not just explore how Irish nationalism influenced Indian nationalism as another example of India being impacted by the West, but how Ireland was affected by these women's involvement. So today we're going to be looking at how these women and their campaigns were received by the Irish press. In other words, we're focusing on what the people of Ireland thought about what was happening in India. Given the strength and impact of the divisions within Ireland, we will compare nationalist newspapers with unionist ones. This will be particularly interesting given that each woman operated at different points in both the Irish and Indian nationalist movements. The first woman that we'll be discussing is Sister Nivedita. She was active in Indian nationalism from 1902 to her death in 1911. At this time, while Home Rule was at the forefront of the political agenda in Ireland by 1900, it was much more of a minority concern in India. Indians were represented by the Indian National Congress, an assembly of high caste Indians set up in 1885, who met annually to discuss issues and possible reforms. In general, these were moderate politicians. They tended to be high caste, highly educated, often wealthy elites, many of whom had been educated in England, so many held sympathies for the British and supported India's place within the empire. Rather than advocating militant action, they pushed for reform and home rule for India still within the empire. However, the British took little notice of their petitions. For instance, these moderates held little power when the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, decided to enact the partition of Bengal in 1905. Curzon was worried about the growing opposition to British rule, and so decided to employ a classic tactic of divide and rule by splitting the area on broadly religious lines. This prompted the Swadeshi movement, which included the widespread boycott of British goods and institutions. This was led by the more extremist wing of the Indian National Congress. Men such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, and other extremist members were prepared to use violence to end British rule, and they wanted Swaraj for India, a more radical demand meaning self-rule or full independence. These groups differed in how they wanted the Congress Party to respond to this growing agitation caused by the partition of Bengal. The moderates refused to support such unrest, causing a split in Congress in 1907. Sister Nivedita tried to rectify this split through publishing articles and talking to members of the Congress. Since 1902, she'd been working with some of the extremist members of the Congress, including Aurobindo Ghosh, to inspire national consciousness and to get some of the smaller revolutionary groups to work together as part of a larger political front against the British. Sister Nivedita seemed to support the extremists and nationalists in their agitation, even if she was not prepared to engage in unrest herself. The Irish reaction to her fairly restrained role and generally conciliatory approach to the splits in Indian nationalism is very interesting. In 1907, an article in the Irish Unionist newspaper, the Belfast Newsletter, reacted to her involvement. In an article called Who Are Pulling the Strings, the writer blames what he calls Irish traitors for the anti-British agitation in India and Egypt. He condemns Sister Nivedita as one of these Irish traitors. The writer quotes another publication, The Labour Leader, which says, It is a curious fact that one of the most eloquent voices of the Swadeshi, Indian Home Rule movement, is an Irish woman trained in the fiery traditions of Irish nationalism, yet the writer quickly suppresses any admiration for this Nivedita. According to him, it is not a curious fact to those who know anything of Ireland, for Irish Romanists have a large hand in all the seditious movements going on within the British Empire today, while Irish Protestants, with the exception of a very few misguided Protestants of sorts, or of no religion, are loyal to the flag. This attitude runs throughout the article and reflects a common trend in the Unionist community. The writer, who seems to be an upper-class Englishman, shows a clear distaste for Irish people, especially Irish Catholics. He writes about what he calls certain samples of Irishmen who join revolutionary groups with a view to gain notoriety by stirring up the people and keeping Ireland in a state of unrest. He doesn't seem to think there's a possibility that these Irish people may be engaging in agitation not just for their own publicity, but in order to secure Ireland's independence from Britain. What is telling in his condemnation of Sis Nivedita and other Irish agitators is the writer's anxiety about the British Empire. Clearly he was worried that the empire could disintegrate as unrest spread through Ireland to India and Egypt, threatening the stability of British rule. The historian Howard Brasted suggests that many imperialists were concerned about what they called the domino theory. This popular idea argued that Irish nationalism represents the seeds of imperial decay, and if this was allowed to grow and eventually succeed, it would set off a chain reaction and the empire would disintegrate. We can fit the author of this Belfast Newsletter article within this same broad group. He suggests that Sis Nivedita and other Irish agitators would initiate imperial decay in India. A very different article appeared in another Unionist newspaper, the Leinster Reporter, on the death of Sis Nivedita in the autumn of 1911. Its headline ran, "Death of Two Noble Irish Women." The article contains two obituaries, one for Sis Nivedita, the other for Mother Anastasia, one of the Sisters of Mercy who nursed the wounded in the Crimean War. By talking about these two noble Irish women in the same article, the writer is putting Sis Nivedita's work in a certain context. She's presented, much like Mother Anastasia, as a religious missionary and a philanthropist. The writer details how she went out to India for the purpose of opening a school for Hindu girls, and she occupied a remarkable position among the Englishwomen who have thrown in their lot with the Indian people. Little is said of her political involvement, only that her house was visited by leading Indians from every province, and there were few English or Americans of distinction passing through Calcutta who did not make the point of seeing her. The Leinster Reporter does not describe the political connection she made with the members of the Indian National Congress. Rather, they describe her like how they would describe a respected upper-class Edwardian lady, perhaps reflecting the less politically charged genre of the obituary. These two Unionist papers, the Belfast Newsletter and the Leinster Reporter, could not be more different in how they presented her. Certainly the Leinster Reporter was known as a more liberal paper, and perhaps because of its position in what would later become the Republic of Ireland, it was less critical of a known agitator, but it also didn't celebrate or even acknowledge her involvement in Indian nationalism. So in the end, both papers failed to grasp the complexity of her life and contribution to Indian society and politics. By choosing to emphasise either her political agitation or her charity work rather than seeing them in the same framework, this gave a purposefully limited account of her life, which was as much a reflection of Irish politics as of the life of this remarkable woman. There are similar contradictions in how the Irish press discussed Annie Besant. Her political activities in India ran from 1914 to the early 1920s, so she was pivotal during a significant moment in Indian nationalism. India's involvement in the First World War had initially been backed by many Indian politicians, with high-profile figures such as Gandhi even pushing for Indians to sign up in defence of the empire. The moderates were back in charge of Congress, and they believed that India would be given self-government as a reward for its part in the war. The historian Richard Davis argues that this was much along the same lines as the approach taken by John Redmond of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Both the Indian moderates and the Irish Party rejected Daniel O'Connell's rallying cry, "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity." Yet some did see the war as exactly this. In India, extremists such as the Ghadar movement advocated the use of violence. However, their agitation was quickly suppressed by the British, who implemented the Defence of India Act in 1915, allowing them to hold agitators for indefinite periods without a trial, and to sentence revolutionaries without a jury. The extremists knew that if they spread unrest, they would be quickly arrested. Therefore, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Annie Besant both set up Home Rule Leagues in 1916. These were classed as debating societies to avoid being banned by the authorities. Annie Besant did not hold as extreme views as Tilak. She wanted India to govern itself, but within the wider sphere of the British Empire. But they worked well together, Tilak sowing unrest in the west, and Besant in the south. This strategy was so successful that by 1917, membership of Tilak and Besant's League had grown to 60,000 in 1917, causing Besant and two other Home Rule agitators to be placed under house arrest in June 1917. In the Irish press, we can see a clear difference between how the Unionist and Nationalist papers reacted to her arrest. Much of the Unionist press followed the British government's line on the arrest. For example, the newspaper The Northern Whig ran an article on Besant's arrest with the headline, "A Dangerous Agitation." The article contains part of a parliamentary debate on her arrest, in which the Secretary of State for India, Austen Chamberlain, defended the Madras government's action. He says, "Mrs. Besant has been engaged in a dangerous political agitation, which might have become highly dangerous and even disastrous to British India." Another Unionist paper, the Derry Journal, did the same. Although in its article with the headline, "A Lady Agitator in India," the writer doesn't even quote Mr. Chamberlain, yet they use his exact phrasing, arguing again that Mrs. Besant has been engaged in a political agitation which had become highly dangerous and even disastrous to India. Clearly both papers were supportive of the British government's approach, and like Chamberlain, saw any opposition as an attack on British interests on the subcontinent. They seemed very critical of her involvement in Indian nationalism, and don't even acknowledge that she was trying to get Home Rule through constitutional means, rather than through violence or militancy. Both these papers were known for their support of British rule in opposition to the Irish Home Rule movement. The readership was largely from the middle-class Protestant community, who were mainly supportive of the British Empire across the globe, and critical of any political or social movement which posed a challenge to this. In contrast, several nationalist papers advocated for Mrs. Besant's release. The Anglo-Celt published an article in July 1917 which questioned the integrity of India's British administrators. It highlighted the incompetence of the British war effort, majoring on the Mesopotamia affair, a failed campaign by the British to take a section of modern-day Iraq from the Ottoman Empire. During this poorly managed campaign, the British suffered over 85,000 casualties, many of them Indian soldiers, who died from their wounds or from starvation and disease. The writer of this Anglo-Celt article questioned whether these men were fit to rule India, suggesting that the Home Rulers' sole demand is that they should be given some voice in the management of their own affairs, instead of being governed by such men as are dealt with in the Mesopotamia report. Further, the writer implies that Home Rule for India is well earned, given their contribution to the war effort. As the headline asks, why make another blunder? The writer worried that the incompetence and inhumanity of the Westminster government would provoke more bloodshed in India by not agreeing to the Home Rulers' demands, and called for Mrs. Besant's immediate release. This was powerful because it undercut two key justifications for British rule in India: the idea of competent government, and British claims to the superiority of British justice and fair play. This is very different to the response of the Unionist paper The Belfast Newsletter to Indian Home Rule agitation. In an article published in August 1918, the Belfast Newsletter strongly encouraged Parliament to oppose a bill put forward by the new Secretary of State Lord Montagu to implement responsible self-government in India. In comparison with the Anglo-Celt, the Belfast Newsletter questions the part that India has played in the war. It suggests that this year it is proposed to raise 500,000 combatants, but there is no reason why India, with its vast population, should not make a much larger addition to the manpower of the empire. Also, the article doesn't actually name Mrs. Besant or Tilak, but it talks of the ignorance and malevolence of anti-British agitators. Again, there is a comparison made between the Irish and Indian nationalists. As the writer argues, there is a noisy, disloyal faction there as in Ireland, but the consequences of yielding to it may be even more disastrous there than here. In both cases, this sought to belittle the nationalist opposition and suggest that they were unrepresentative of the general population. Besant and Tilak did seem to take inspiration from the Irish Home Rule movement. Several historians, such as Richard Davis and Howard Brasted, have discussed the emulative urge that existed between Ireland and India. The emulative urge is an idea used in economics to describe how consumers may copy others' behaviour and shopping habits. In the same sense, many Indian nationalists watched the progression of nationalism in Ireland. In 1913, it appeared that Ireland was going to secure self-governance after a long Home Rule movement. Indian nationalists also closely watched the Easter Rising of 1916 and saw the harsh consequences that these agitators faced. Therefore, the historian Majumdar suggests that Mrs. Besant and Tilak used the Irish Home Rule movement as a model for their own Home Rule movement, rather than more militant action, and like the Irish Home Rulers, we can see in the article that Besant and Tilak were given the same excuses for Westminster's opposition to their demands. The Belfast Newsletter article of 1918 argues that the British cannot give India home rule while they are fighting the war. More than that, though, it doesn't seem that the writer wants India to ever be allowed to self-govern. As he writes, "We believe that no one living will see the day when it will be possible to bestow Dominion home rule upon India without running the greatest risks." But the situation was changing in Ireland too. This Belfast Newsletter article was written in 1918, and by the end of the year, Sinn Féin would become the largest Irish party in Westminster. They would go on to convene their own assembly in Dublin and declare independence for Ireland in 1919. In the same sense, Indian nationalism moved into a new phase, with the massacre of peaceful protesters in Amritsar in 1919, the growth of mass nationalism, and the rise of Gandhi as the most prominent Indian nationalist leader in the 1920s. These parallel developments have often been noted by historians, such as Christopher Bailey and Deirdre McMahon, as well as the links that developed between Indian and Irish nationalists in the context of an increasingly interconnected world. Though the historian Richard Davis presents an interesting account of these links. He discusses how Gandhi vehemently rejected any of the similarities between Ireland and India. The Indian nationalist press followed Irish developments closely. They saw the successes of Sinn Féin at Eamon de Valera in securing independence for Ireland, as well as Sinn Féin's use of violence in the Irish War of Independence to prevent the British from taking control of their country. Thus Gandhi struggled to prevent Indian nationalism moving in this direction. He resisted comparisons between Ireland and India, even saying that Sinn Féin's violence was worse than the Amritsar massacre, in which the British had opened fire on a market, killing 500 to 600 people. Gandhi wanted his non-cooperation movement of the early 1920s to be built on a shrine of passive resistance, but not the passive resistance of Sinn Féin, which was backed by force. Therefore, when the movement became violent in Chowri Chowra, when a mob burned down a police station, he halted the movement. Unlike Besant and Tilak then, Gandhi did not feel this emulative urge to follow the example set by Ireland. Yet the fact that Gandhi had to resist these parallels so strongly between Ireland and India does prove that other Indian nationalists did see Ireland as an example for their struggle. The third woman that we'll be discussing is Margaret Cousins. Margaret Cousins was foremost a feminist, establishing the Women's Indian Association in 1917 and the All India Women's Conference in 1926. She devoted her life to campaigning for female suffrage and social reform. This will be discussed more extensively in the last episode of this series, but we cannot forget that she was also involved in some nationalist activities. By the late 1920s and 1930s, Indian nationalism had moved into a new phase. Gandhi, alongside the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, took part in a civil disobedience campaign. This unrest was prompted by the 1929 Irwin Declaration, which included a statement explaining that India would gradually be given the right to self-governance, and they would eventually be given dominion status like that of Australia or Canada. The limitations of these reforms sparked a new civil disobedience movement throughout India. Gandhi led his followers on salt marches, others boycotted liquor shops and burned foreign clothes. There were widespread demonstrations and protests. The British implemented emergency powers, introducing censorship and banning public meetings, while the Indian National Congress was also made illegal. From January 1932 to March 1933, 120,000 Indian nationalists were arrested. Margaret Cousins was one of this number. She spoke at a large public gathering in December 1932 and urged her audience to defy the emergency ordinances put in place by the British and exercise free speech. Cousins was arrested and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment. The Unionist press back in Ireland covered her arrest, although many papers just repeated her charge of disseminating sedition. The Northern Whig published an article in December 1913 which read, "Mrs. Margaret Cousins, wife of Dr. James Cousins, the Irish poet and theosophist, appeared before the magistrate here today to answer a charge of disseminating sedition. Mrs. Cousins refused to enter into a bond to be of good behaviour for a year, and was remanded in custody until tomorrow." A similar article appeared in the Belfast Newsletter with the headline, "Disseminating Sedition." Neither of the papers detail explicitly what sedition she'd actually been involved in, or mention her links with Gandhi's civil disobedience movement. It's hard to say why they don't acknowledge this. Perhaps they wanted to undermine her cause by suggesting that she was acting alone. Perhaps they wanted to deny the extent of support within India, or perhaps it's because there was censorship and there was little evidence available. Of course, the Unionist press did not support Gandhi and Indian nationalism in the 1930s, as they wanted the empire to remain intact, and so it's possible that they wanted to avoid mentioning the gravity of the situation for the British in India. By contrast, the nationalist press gave a more detailed account of Cousins' connections with Indian nationalism. For example, the Irish Press, a paper founded by Eamon de Valera in 1931, published an article about Mrs. Cousins' arrest with the headline, "Irishwoman jailed in India, supporter of National Congress movement." The writer goes on to describe how she was found guilty of advocating defiance of the Indian ordinances during speeches made in Madras recently, and she has worked with Dr. Annie Besant for 17 years for Indian freedom when she was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment. Similarly, an article appeared in the nationalist paper The Kerry Champion with the headline, "A Worthy Daughter of Ireland." In this they are quoting Mrs. Cousins' speech from the dock. "I would not be a worthy daughter of Ireland if I did not stand shoulder to shoulder with the wonderful women and spirited men of the Congress of this time." The emphasis in the Irish nationalist press on Cousins' Irish connections, even though she'd lived in India for 17 years at this time, was a very significant gesture of support for her cause and for her methods. Cousins was being portrayed as a representative of Ireland in India. She appreciated being presented this way. In her autobiography, she wrote, "The urge for freedom was born within me, and any individual or group that tried to interpret its own freedom as freedom to tyrannize over others brought the 7th century struggle of my beloved Ireland to a point of indignation that showed itself in action." Clearly she fought for this freedom for India because of her Irish background. She saw them as joint causes, both of which would bring down the empire. It is also interesting how much more explicit the nationalist press are about Margaret Cousins' agitation. While the Unionist press repeat the British government's line that Cousins had been disseminating sedition, the Irish press and the Kerry Champion both acknowledge that her defiance against British censorship was to serve the struggle for Indian freedom. In doing so, they are portraying her as this ambassador for Ireland in India, a political agitator who had been imbued in the traditions of Irish nationalism, and was bringing these to Gandhi's civil disobedience campaign. The interest that the nationalist press was taking in Margaret Cousins further shows how aware the new Irish state was of its position in the world and the need for allies on the international stage. Certainly the 1920s and 30s did see Irish nationalists become more internationalist in their outlook. The historian Kate O'Malley has argued that the Soviet Union's organisation, the League Against Imperialism, helped with this. It encouraged connections to form between Irish and Indian nationalists. Irish nationalists could look to India and other fronts where the empire was crumbling and find that there were parallels in their nationalist causes. O'Malley particularly notes that after the Second World Congress of the League Against Imperialism in 1929, the Dublin branch of the League became more internationalist, with the radical Irish press publicising the histories of other imperial nations, including India. This is one small part of the larger story of Irish and Indian connections, but perhaps this was why more interest was taken in Margaret Cousins by the nationalist press than by the Unionist press. Irish nationalists could see in Margaret Cousins a representative of the transnational anti-imperialism that was growing in the 1920s and 30s. There is a clear difference in how Margaret Cousins was represented by the Nationalist and Unionist press, particularly in her campaign for political independence for India. The same can be said for Annie Besant's more moderate involvement in Indian Home Rule, which was condemned by the Unionist press, while it was celebrated by the nationalist papers, who could draw obvious parallels with the situation in Ireland. This was different for the less-known figure of Sister Nivedita, where the criticism was less overt and the two Unionist papers chose to highlight different aspects of her work. Overall, a survey of a number of newspapers suggests that both sides of the political press saw in these women's lives the connections between Irish and Indian nationalism, and depending on their political persuasion, this changed how the press presented them. A key theme in all of this was that of the British Empire. In the early 20th century, it appeared that the empire was gradually falling apart as new nationalist movements spread around the world. The British were struggling to keep their hold on countries like Ireland, India, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, which is now modern-day Iraq. As fears ran rampant about the supposed domino effect, bringing about imperial collapse, imperialists worried that Britain would lose its status as a world power. Thus, the Irish Unionist press were nervous of the part that these women were playing in the disintegration of the empire, and criticised them for this, whereas the nationalist press commended these women for the exact same reason. As far as they saw it, these women were bringing the methods and agitation of Irish nationalism to India, and in doing so, they were bringing the seeds of imperial decay. Therefore, these women must be put in the context of the radical links and networks that formed between Ireland and India at this time. These connections caused Irish nationalists to provide support, encouragement, and even practical assistance to their Indian counterparts. Historians such as Howard Brasted and Christopher Bailey have suggested these connections were long-standing, going back as far as the 1880s. Several Irish MPs had tried to represent Indian grievances in Westminster. Irish Home Rulers and radicals, too, had forged links with prominent Indian moderates, including Dadabhai Naoroji and Gannon Jamahan Tagore. In the early 20th century, too, Kate O'Malley has discussed the more radical connections formed between the Irish and Indian nationalists in the League Against Imperialism. Through this organisation, several Indians became connected to Sinn Féin and found that they could discuss the ways in which India could free itself from the yoke of British rule. But that's not to suggest that Indian nationalism was derivative, that it was based on the Irish model and merely transferred to the Indian context. Rather, it reveals a vibrant interchange of ideas which impacted Ireland as well as India. And it's interesting to reflect on how Irish journalists were able to shape perceptions of the Indian nationalist movement for ordinary people, who themselves were dealing with these big questions on a daily basis. I hope this has given you something to think about, and I hope you join me for the next episode in this series on these women's roles in Indian feminism.